Hi, I'm Douglas Wilson, the host of Man Rampant. In honor of the upcoming release of Season 6, just around the corner, found exclusively on Canon Plus, of course, we are releasing a classic from Season 5 where Voddie Baucham answers the question, Are you a Christian Nationalist? We hope you enjoy it. And if you can't bring yourself to enjoy it, we hope you can at least stare at the screen, bug-eyed. Dr. Voddie Baucham, welcome to Man Rampant. It's great to have you.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So I want to begin with what you're doing. What are you doing in Zambia? You're the Dean of the School of Divinity at African Christian University. Is that correct?
Yeah, we've been there almost 8 years now, to be 8 years in August. Went there to help start ACU. The school was started by the Reformed Baptist Church Association of Zambia. It's a classical Christian liberal arts university. And
Confessionally reformed?
Confessionally reformed. It's a 1689 school. And right now offering degrees in agriculture, business education, and theology. Again, hoping to broaden and expand that. But as I said, right now we're in our 7th year at the university.
Okay.
And we're growing slowly but surely. And
students mostly Zambian,
overwhelming majority of them are Zambians. Although our first graduate was South African, interestingly enough. But yeah, the students are mostly Zambians, mostly local. Yeah.
So I understand that a few years ago, maybe a decade or two ago, Zambia became officially a Christian country. What does that mean? What flavor is it?
Yeah, I think it was maybe in the mid to late 90s.
Okay.
They became a constitutionally Christian republic, identified themselves as such, and it's not a particular brand.
Okay.
It's not a particular denominational brand.
Right.
It's Protestant Christianity, but not a particular denominational brand.
Does it just say in the Constitution we're a Christian country, or do they acknowledge the Apostles' Creed, or is it?
No, it just says that they're a Christian republic, that they're tolerant of other faiths and recognize people's right to hold those and practice those, but that the country is a Christian country.
So you made a comment yesterday in casual conversation that I wanted to pursue for our discussion here. You've been there for 7 or 8 years, and you were mentioning one of the things that you noticed coming back, or the juxtaposition of being there and coming back here. You said there was something about it that cheered you up or encouraged you, and that being there's a lot of infrastructure, Christian infrastructure here that's still left that we don't see anymore. Is that, could
Absolutely.
you develop that?
Listen, like anything else, it's kind of like as parents, everybody else compliments our kids and all we see is what's wrong with them. And it's like that as well, I guess, with your country, with your nation. And it's leaving America, and this is not the first time we left. Went to school in England, and even when we were in England, another, first world country, I missed America and realized that it was a blessing to be, from this place, and even more so being in a developing nation and being outside of the Western world, just being able to recognize the incredible depth and breadth of our Christian heritage here, and
It's still functioning.
Yes,
it's still there.
Yes, yeah, it's amazing in so many different ways, and I've just grown to appreciate that. Also, I've come to appreciate how big America is. Zambia is the size of Texas, and there's 17 million people there, and there's 350 million Americans, 50 states here, and it's so incredibly varied. I appreciate the diversity of America. It's so ironic that Americans talk about America being a racist country. I believe, and others have argued and tried to demonstrate, that America's arguably one of, if not the least racist country in the world. And I live now in a homogeneous nation. There are some people there who are not Zambian or not black or whatever. But interestingly enough, you know, in Zambia, there are people who may be of, a friend of mine who's Indian, his parents were from India. They moved to Zambia. He was born and raised in Zambia. Zambians don't necessarily consider him a Zambian because he's not black, because he's Indian, you know? Whereas, you know, here,
He'd be an American.
absolutely, without question, you know? So I even, you know, really just came to appreciate, you know, that and those aspects. So yeah, there's a lot of things, and again, just the wealth of resources, the strength, and this turns people's heads, but the strength of the church in America, you know, and it is. There are thousands of prophets who haven't bowed the knee to Baal, but most Americans don't realize that because we just look at media and social media, and there's names that we know out there, and we think that's Christianity, right?
If they wobble,
Yes.
it's all over.
Yes. Yeah.
So when you talk about America's still functioning Christian heritage, are you talking about in our political institutions or our legal traditions or the cultural shaping that the church still has, or all of the above?
I think more the latter. I think there's more erosion in those former things. I think there's more erosion in the political institutions and such. But I'm talking more about the latter. Okay. And it's interesting that it's not just, I don't just recognize that. It's, you know, Zambians look at what's happening in America and they're puzzled. And the reason they're puzzled is because they recognize that heritage, you know, so they're over there trying to backfill, you know, and build the kind of, you know, foundations and pillars that we've taken for granted over here, and they look our way and go like, what are you guys doing?
So it's like a heritage that we have that we don't see,
Yeah.
and therefore don't see how much we're losing or threatening to lose, and they see what they don't have, but which we do have, and they see us being, what, careless with it?
Yeah, careless with it, or worse, because there are people who recognize it and are warring against it, right? They see it as wicked. They see it as evil. And, you know, people outside of America, like people in Zambia who recognize the great benefit of it, they're going, okay, where else in the world are you trying to emulate, right? Like, where's this place that you see where whatever it is that you're trying to do
Is there and working.
And has produced more liberty and prosperity than where you are, you know? Yeah, it's mind-boggling.
So the people here, the woke revolution in the West, that is trying to undermine our institutions and get rid of every vestige of Christianity. It's interesting, and maybe you could comment a little bit on this. Just a few weeks ago, I think it was, Uganda passed a law saying enough of the homosexuality, all done with that. And it was really striking how all of a sudden the inner colonialism of the West
rose up. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's interesting to me, and it's fascinating to me. And I think it just speaks to the hypocrisy, right? People are arguing, you know, this whole post-colonial mindset. You know, indigenous people need to be left to be indigenous people, and you know, we don't need to impose Western ideas on them. And then, you know, here's Uganda who does something that's not woke, and the woke who claim that they're, you know, anti-colonial have a very colonial response.
Right.
Right. So yeah, it's telling.
It's telling.
Yeah.
So white people telling people not to be white, it's about the whitest thing you can do.
Yeah.
Right.
Especially when you do it in the name of Marx, Freud, Foucault, and Darwin, all white males.
Right.
Right? Yeah. So
Dead white males.
yes, yes.
All right.
And we're not even supposed to read dead white males anymore.
Yeah,
Just propagate their ideology,
let's
apparently.
start with Darwin.
Yeah.
All right, let's start. Okay. So one of the things I'm interested in pursuing in this is with living in Zambia, you're not you're not in the middle of the hurly-burly of American politics.
Right.
Right?
Praise the Lord.
Praise the Lord. Gotta get an amen.
Yeah.
So, and then you periodically come back to visit and you say, jeepers,
Yeah.
and then you go back to Zambia. We, over the last last year or so, Canon Press published a book, The Case for Christian Nationalism, and the leftist media was already trying to represent or paint anybody who is to the right of Mitt Romney as a Christian nationalist. It's sort of like the bugbear of,
Right.
and here in American politics, Christian nationalism is supposed to be swapped out for, America first, like make America great, Christian nationalism.
Right.
It's all the same thing. But in Zambia, Christian nationalism wouldn't have anything to do with American anything.
It doesn't have anything to do with it. It's a declared constitutionally Christian republic. I think you'd have to define that as the epitome of Christian nationalism, right?
Right.
And so I'm just really interested to know what the people who argue, again, because here you have to be very careful, white Christian nationalism, and that's really to score intersectional points, right? Because that's three oppressor classes, right?
Right.
But there were no white people
Doing that, driving
twisting Zambians' arms, for them to identify themselves that way. And many countries in sub-Saharan Africa would identify themselves
as Christian.
as Christian nations without apology, right? So it's really interesting from my perspective, to sort of watch people clutch their pearls over here and just go, yeah, well, what about this? And they really don't want to talk about that, because it's very inconvenient.
Right. An inconvenient truth.
Yeah.
So if you have, and this is something I've got a book coming out with Canon next month called Mere Christendom. And Christendom is the idea of multiple nations, different nations, confessing their faith in the fact that Christ rose from the dead, basically. So Christian nationalism doesn't mean denominational nationalism.
Right.
Right. You could be generically
State church.
State church,
Right.
yeah. So separation of church.
Because that's the other thing, right?
Yeah, go ahead.
Because England has a state church,
right.
right? So there's another instance of Christian nationalism.
Christian nationalism.
And the accession, and everything with Charles, I mean, if people listened, if they paid any attention, I mean, you heard highly religious verbiage
Right.
in all of that stuff,
Right.
And I didn't hear people
complaining
about the Christian nationalism, in all of that, which is
Right.
formalized and
So, if we say let's back up. Would you agree with me that secularism, sort of the white liberal view that was sort of the post-World War II, what Fukuyama said, the end of history, liberalism has arrived at its final state, this is the way it's going to be, there's no more further development. Would you agree with me that secularism is on its last legs? It's not able to function, or there doesn't seem to be a way forward.
Lord willing.
Lord willing. Yeah. Prayer request time.
Yeah.
It seems to me that if you're not able to say the boys' restroom and the girls' restroom because you don't know what a boy is and you don't know what a girl is, that's confessing. You don't know that you're confessing, but you're confessing that you don't know what a human being is. And if you don't know what a human being is, because we're created in the image of God, male and female, if you don't know what a human being is, then how can you have a vision for governance of human beings?
Yeah.
How is it possible?
But it's worse than that, because we do know. We're just pretending not to know.
Yeah.
It's
lying.
We're lying. We're lying. We're virtue signaling. We're lying. We're pretending not to know. Everybody knows. Your brain is designed to know. You can see someone, from 10 yards away,
Yeah.
and your brain looks at that frame and starts giving you information immediately as to whether that's a male or a female, you know?
Or you've seen the meme with the T-shirt that says there are 57 genders, and you can order it in male or female.
Yeah, yeah.
Men's or women's.
Yes.
You can run, but you can't hide.
Yes, yeah.
So
So yeah, we know. We're pretending not to know, and that's far worse.
and we're pretending not to know, and then coercing other people into silence with
Yes.
threats of job loss and career ruined, and it's just, and that seems to me to be not the future. I don't see how there's any way forward.
Can't last.
It can't last.
It can't.
So in the long run, this is the good news. In the long run, stupidity is not a plan. It's not sustainable.
Right.
Stupidity is not sustainable. But that means that we're going to have to organize ourselves somehow when this all comes crashing down. And you mentioned, was it you that mentioned the other day you just finished a book by Yoram Hazony,
Yes.
Conservatism?
Yes.
He was a guest on the show here. He wrote another book called The Virtue of Nationalism. And people can group either globally, you can have a global organization or national organization or tribal. So when people say I'm against Christian nationalism, and then each one of those, tribal, national, or global, can be believing or unbelieving.
Right.
So unbelieving tribes are pretty bad. You could have a cannibal tribe that would
Right.
eat you, unbelieving tribe, or you could have a believing tribe, and that's okay.
Right.
But then you can have a believing nation or an unbelieving nation, and then you could have a believing global, 50 years before Jesus comes again, a global arrangement, right, was believing or unbelieving. And the globalist elites now are unbelieving, and they
Right.
won't. So the question is, what do you think is the organization most suited to human flourishing? Tribalism is going to devolve into wars,
Right.
right? And globalism is going to devolve into tyranny.
Right.
And so
And then wars.
and in wars.
Yeah.
And then, but that leaves us with
It
nationalism,
does.
right?
It does. Yeah, but people are not being that rational, right? And here's the deal: Christian nationalism. I wasn't hearing about Christian nationalism till all of a sudden, when the whole woke, social justice, racial justice, when people began to stand up against that, right? And they began to demand receipts and began to push back. And the people who were holding on to that ideology didn't have an argument anymore. All of a sudden, there was just this shift. And it was as though it happened overnight. And everybody on the woke side started going, and this is after everybody, you started seeing people in school board meetings,
yeah.
On CRT, and people were just nailing it. Because first it was, there is no such thing. Then it was, well, nobody understands it. Then it's, well, it's not being taught in schools. People are standing up there at their school board meeting, and it is a thing. We do understand it. By the way, here's the evidence that it's being taught in our schools. And then all of these Christians, who were singing that song began to say, are you concerned about Christian nationalism? What? What are you talking about?
Right.
And nobody was defining their terms, and people are still not defining their terms. And so I mean, it's all over the place. So it's almost not even a real thing, And what's ironic about that is that because these people were pushing that, there are a lot of people who are now thinking about these issues who weren't necessarily thinking about them before.
Right.
Right? You start calling me a name, and first I'm like, okay, I might be. Let me go look this up.
Sounds pretty good. Tell me more.
Yeah.
Okay, so either, if we just break it down, we're nations are decision-making bodies,
Yeah.
which means that nations are moral organisms. This is something that Abraham Kuyper taught. A state, a collection of people, is a moral organism because it can make moral or immoral decisions.
Right.
They can declare war, justly or unjustly. They could conduct genocide unjustly.
Right.
They could gather up virgins for the harem. They can do all kinds.
And they have roles and norms and mores and
they can break treaties or not keep treaties,
Yep.
which means that they're moral organisms, which means that their decisions are either going to please God or not please God.
Right.
They're going to do what's right or not do what's right.
Right.
And I should turn to a Christian who's opposed to Christian nationalism and say, well, do you think we should do what God wants us to do or not?
Yeah.
And if he says, well, I don't think we have to pay any attention to what God says, then I say, okay, God doesn't
That's
care.
a not.
That's a yeah. But if he says, oh, God doesn't care what we do, I say, okay, then let's make it a Christian nation.
Yeah. Yeah.
God doesn't
Yeah.
care.
Yeah.
If God doesn't care,
God doesn't tell what we do, but not that.
anything but that.
But not that. That's
The
kinda-
one thing.
yeah.
The one thing Jesus doesn't want you
Yes,
to do.
yes.
Is honor Him.
Yes. That's kind of like, when all of the woke stuff was going on, and before Fault Lines came out, I was speaking on a lot of that stuff, and it was everybody's talking about we need to elevate black voices, and people would go, well, what about Voddie? Well, not his.
That's right. he's too black.
Not his. Not his. Yeah, no, not his. But it's the same thing here, right? It's anything but Christianity,
Right.
which is ironic coming from Christians.
Right. So, go ahead.
I think this comes down also to our historical and theological illiteracy.
Okay.
We, for so long, pragmatism has ruled the day. The church growth movement
Within
and
the
whatnot,
church, within the
church,
Christians.
yes, and the church growth movement and everything else, and pragmatism sort of ruled the day. And I think in the Young Restless Reform movement, there were a lot of people who came to the Young Restless Reform movement because Calvinism became cool.
Right.
And that was a pragmatic decision. They didn't become confessional, right?
Right.
But Calvinism became cool. And in the midst of all of this, there weren't a lot of people with sort of well-developed theological convictions when it came to the civil sphere.
Right.
And I think that's kind of what we're dealing with now, is without those convictions, people sort of bought into the secular humanist idea of the secular state.
Right.
Right? And really sort of took on board this idea that anything other than that, had to be a form of theocratic tyranny.
So when you have a secular value, and Christians say all we should want is a place at the table. That's all we should want, is to have our voice heard and have a place at the table. And I'd say, well, who's the cook? What are we going to be served?
Who built the table?
Who built the table? Yeah. Whose room is this?
Yeah.
So an illustration I've used before is in modern Western Christianity. Let's say an outfit like Walmart decided to have Religious Appreciation Day, a week, and the Buddhists got 20% off on Monday, and the Hindus 20% off on Tuesday, and the Christians 20% off on Wednesday, and the Muslims on Thursday, and so forth. Most Christians would be pleased and excited that we got a day. Right? Okay, we got included in the pantheon of gods, right? And we say, well, they're being even-handed. And I say, no, they're not being even-handed, because every day is money day.
Right.
Right? There's a God over the system.
Right.
When you apportion it out, there's some sort of God over the entire thing somewhere. Because when you trumpet secular values, well, as Bonson used to say, by what standard?
Right.
When you say this is good and that is bad, religious tolerance is good. Well, says who?
Right.
By what standard are you saying this?
Right. And the other thing is, if you're honest, and if you're a student of history, and if you really want people to be free and to be tolerated, then what's the religious system that has allowed that in the world?
That created it.
Unlike any other.
Right.
It's ours. It's Western civilization. It's Christendom, right? It's the Christian West.
Right.
The Christian West is where those freedoms exist for people. So the great irony is that these people are arguing for something that Western civilization created, but they're arguing for it in a way that will destroy the very civilization that created the thing they're saying that they want.
Right.
And there's no other civilization that has been able to give it.
Yeah. Liberty of conscience, religious liberty, those things were things that grew up out of the turmoil of the Reformation.
Yeah.
And there was a great deal of turmoil. There were religious wars, and
Yes.
it took a few centuries to sort these things out.
Yes.
But it was the Christian West that figured out that we need to have tolerance on denominational distinctives,
Yes.
which is different than being tolerant of people who chop babies up into pieces and sell the pieces, or being tolerant of people who fly airplanes into skyscrapers.
Right.
There's a difference between being tolerant of things that should be tolerated because we have a standard that tells us what is criminal and what's a difference of opinion.
Right.
And Christians have that framework. But now we're living in crazy town now where we don't have any framework. With this shooting that just happened in Nashville, people are now saying, well, the shooter was a victim also, right? And the press secretary of the White House says the trans community is now under attack.
Under siege.
Under siege. Are you kidding me?
Yeah. That's mind-boggling.
Right.
Yeah, that's slavery is freedom. That's Orwellian, man. That's
Yeah, and it reminds me of that. There's a Solzhenitsyn quote that says, "They know they're lying. We know that they're lying. They know that we know that they're lying, and still they lie."
yes.
And they continue to lie because it works.
Yeah.
So far, they've been getting away with it. They can just be as brazen as all get out and say, well, the problem is, and I think we're going to see within a few years, the push that says Christianity is the problem.
Well, we're already seeing that. It's in the literature. It's in the woke social justice literature. Christianity is the source of that hegemonic oppressive power in the West. Christianity is the enemy of the woke, which is ironic for those, arguing for a woke church.
Because Christianity is hierarchical. There's no getting away from it. It's a monarchy. Christ is king.
Yeah.
It's not a democracy. It's not egalitarian. And the supreme power in the cosmos is a father.
Yeah.
Which makes it patriarchal.
Yeah.
It's a patriarch. It's the patriarchy.
It's the patriarchy.
It's the patriarchy.
Patriarchy.
And we don't want to smash it.
Right.
All right. So, what do we say to our brothers, fellow Christian brothers, they're not evil people themselves. They're not woke necessarily themselves, but they've gotten the idea in their heads that their job is to try to make Christianity winsome to the woke. These people, they do bad things, but it's our task to be winsome to them.
Yeah, I think that goes back to the pragmatism that I talked about earlier. That's that whole church growth movement mentality that says you put a wet finger in the air and find out what people want, and then you give them that so that they'll come. Right. And then once they come, whatever it took to bring them is what it's going to take to keep them. Right. So you just keep, and I think that tendency, that inclination to say, our job at the end of the day is to please men. I think it comes out of that same soil.
Okay, so I agree.
So we got to get to that soil. The answer to your question is what we do with them is we go to that soil. Instead of dealing with the fruit, we take them to the root.
Why do you want to please men?
Yes.
Right. Instead of preaching a message that would have been true had none of these people ever been born.
Yes.
whether you like it or not is irrelevant. It's my job to declare it.
Yes, and I think the quintessential example of this is the detransitioners, right?
Okay, right?
Do you really love? If you really loved them, you'd have said something before they did irreversible damage.
Right.
To quote the title of another book, right?
Right.
If you the really loving thing to do for that child is not to lead them down or follow them down a path that will lead to things that won't be undoable, right? That's not the loving thing. They're going to look at you years from now and say,
You were silent
Yes.
when they were lying to me.
how'd you let me do this to myself? You know? And so I think we're defining love wrong.
Do you think that there's a hesitance to speak into any issue like that comes down to a basic moral point? When if you speak into it, someone's going to say, by what standard? And you're going to have to say, Moses said or Jesus said. And then they're going to say, because there's this secularist idol that says, I've got to appeal to standards that are self-evident to everybody, that are sort of in the air, and I can't quote Moses or Jesus. It's just got to be some.
Here's what's interesting, though. You know, in that recent discussion with Joy Reid and Jim Wallace, and I don't know the name of the transgender person that was there, it was amazing to me that, you know, these two white males were making unapologetic arguments from their Christian faith.
Okay.
Right? I'm a Christian, and as a Christian, you know, I believe this, and, you know, I'm a Christian, and as a Christian, I'm appalled at this. And they were calling other people heretics, right? These people don't represent Christianity. These people, and Joy Reid, if you and I were on her show doing that,
Right.
I'm come on now. Well, first of all, we wouldn't be,
Right.
But just
Yeah, let's be honest.
Hey, but we could dream, right? We could dream, but and if we were, the argument would be, you know, Christian nationalism, you know, unacceptable, out of bounds. Who are you to, you know, impose your morality, so on and so forth. So these people are not opposed to those kind of arguments per se. They're just opposed to the ones that come from Christ the King.
Anybody that would get in the way of the revolution
Yes.
can't speak to whatever reason we can come up with. They can't
Yes.
speak to it. If someone's willing to advance the sexual revolution or give a principled argument for not getting in the way of it, well, here's the microphone. Here,
Right.
Here you go.
Here it is for now,
Here it is for now.
right? But eventually you will believe something that they won't tolerate.
Right. Because the left devours their own.
Yes.
Eventually. Okay, so do you have come back to the place where we started, where you're generally more encouraged when you come back and look at the state of things in America than many conservative American Christians are, particularly the conservative American Christians who just now woke up. You know, they've been the conservative version of woke for 2 weeks. And
Yeah.
they're going, what, you know,
Right.
what are they doing?
Right.
And they think the sky is falling in just some horrendous
Right.
way. What would you say to them to encourage them?
Yeah. I'd say the problem is real.
Yeah.
I mean, absolutely, the problem is real. And the wheels are falling off in many ways. But America's huge. 350 million people.
Right.
Not everybody's gone crazy.
Right.
And in fact, I would argue that most people, Christians, we're talking about Christians who are Christians, indeed, they've not gone crazy. They don't have microphones and they don't have cameras in front of them, but they've not gone crazy. And the other thing, I would say that I think COVID showed us something, that not everybody everywhere in every state had the same experience and the same reality, and not every state is gone to the same degree.
Because they had different governors.
Because they had different governors. And I've been saying for decades, listen, because we've reduced everything to national politics, right? Mm-hmm. Everything is about the presidential election. It's more important who your sheriff is than who your president is, right? Mm-hmm. And I think people kind of got that. They saw that, right? And in the same way, that we saw sort of some local heroes, those encouraging local heroes. That same thing is true hundreds of times over in terms of local churches.
So let me finish with this. How would you answer, this is maybe a question you've gotten before, how would you answer the objection, well, it's all very well for you. You went off and hid in Zambia.
Yeah.
And you guys up in Moscow, you're hiding out in Sherwood Forest. And you've got your own little enclave here, and the sheriff of Nottingham is. So if someone said you're hiding out in Zambia and we're hiding out in Idaho, but I've got to live here in Chicago, or I've got to live here. How would you answer someone who says, this is a retreat and not a strategic advance?
Yeah, well, first of all, I left before the wheels came off. Right. That's number one. Secondly, I live in a country where most of the stoplights don't work. So, the idea that we went to, that we went to some retreat, that's crazy. Oh, boy. So again, and thirdly, you have to bloom where you're planted, right? Yeah. And you've been here since what, 75?
75, yeah.
So
way before the wheels fell off.
Yeah. We have to bloom where we're planted, and I think that's a cop out. Yeah. I really do. I think that's a cop out. And the other thing is that there are a lot of ways to contribute. You used the illustration earlier today of the submarine, and the cook.
The cook and the torpedo man are both fighting.
And the torpedo man, both fighting. And so I'm back here, on a regular basis, right. Making contributions that I can make. Mm-hmm. We haven't decided to just
abandon. You haven't washed your hands of this.
We haven't decided to just wash our hands of it and turn in the magic passport and so no, we're still in the fight.
All right. Well, thank you so much for.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you. Yeah.
If you have a question, feel free to make your way to one of the microphones here. I'll call on you if I can see you.
Good afternoon.
Afternoon.
I saw you in Houston for the Southern Baptist Convention when it was down there. And you had a message in the founders' breakfast. You remember that? Uh-huh. You had some scathing things to say about the goings-on of the Southern Baptist Convention. And my question has to do with, I'm from Canada, and our Canadian church is very much asleep at the wheel, to put it nicely. And you have fought long and hard inside Southern Baptist circles to kind of wake up that denomination. Do you have any advice or anything you'd like to say for someone who is fighting the battle in Canada to wake up the church there? Is there anything, any pitfalls, anything we should avoid, or should I just give up now?
Yeah. Well, and I would just say we do what we can when and where we can, and for me, one of the reasons that we contributed and participated as long as we did in the SBC was because it's not a denomination, but a convention of confessing free churches. So, on the one hand, it was, if there's something we can say, if there's something we can do, that's great. On the other hand, it was, they don't dictate anything to my local church, and that's where it matters. So for us, we were able to sort of, keep that keep that tension. But our church is now, joined another association. So everybody has to make that decision for themselves. It just depends on, where the Lord has you, and it depends on what kind of, influence the Lord has given you and what kind of opportunities are available. But, contribute what you can, do what you can while you can. And then when you can't, bid farewell,
Yeah.
I'd like to, this is probably for Doug mostly, but both of you, really, I'd like to hear you address sexual chaos as a tactic of the implementation of Marxist government.
Yeah. Sexual chaos is, Chesterton once said that free love is the first and most obvious bribe that can be offered to a slave. So sexual license is a benefit or a freebie or something that can be given to everyone that a lot of people will be attracted to because of their fallenness and their lustfulness and so on. They'll be attracted to it, but it's profoundly destabilizing. So when you have sexual anarchy or promiscuity or widely available pornography, and the whole thing is, you cannot build a stable society with that kind of thing going on. Because if you have, this is something I learned from George Gilder. Canon Press is going to be releasing soon a re-release of Gilder's book, Men and Marriage. And I learned this wonderful truth from Gilder, which is if you have men and women think about sexuality very differently. And if you subordinate women's sexuality to male sexuality, if you take the man's sexual cycle is from arousal to climax, the woman's from arousal to when the kid graduates from college. That's the difference. And if you subordinate women's sexuality to men's, what you get is the sexual ethic of a boatload full of Vikings or a motorcycle gang. It's just dissolute. But if you subordinate male sexuality to the woman's cycle, what you get is civilization. What you get is buildings and institutions and children with an education and children with, all of a sudden you get civilization. And so I believe that one of the Marxist tactics has been to give us the bribe, the transparent bribe of sexual license that has the effect of destabilizing families, has the effect of blowing families and communities and churches apart. Nothing can blow a church apart like a sexual scandal, it's just terrible. And conservative churches that have been fighting the onslaught of this, when something gets through, when some of the world leaks in and there's some sort of problem, then the world turns on you and says, we've got to investigate you guys. It's just awful, and it's transparently wicked, and it really is a Marxist technique. If you want stable societies, you have to have family dinners every night at 6. Yes.
I just wanted to make a comment that moving to Moscow, as I know many people have, is definitely not a retreat either. I think a lot of people come here to mature and to grow and to build. And you get to a point, a threshold, where you're unable to do that in the communities, especially with churches that have fallen asleep. Yep. And as I was in high school and went to a public school for the first time, I saw firsthand how bad things were. And kind of like a drain, every freshman class that came in, it was like another wave, just extremely worse than the one before. And we're still in that spiral. And I've wondered, just with knowing history, I've always just seen it as this is going to end in severe persecution for Christians. It's just going to get worse and worse, and we're just not going to be allowed. Do you see that as just the next logical step in this craziness? Or is there even just our nation changing and being taken over, the degradation or just the disintegration of our society, what do you see as the next step in our lifetime or the next, our kids?
I'll answer that first, and maybe you have something to say about this. I think Voddie's answer about federalism ties into this, because I think there's no doubt in my mind that the secular progressive left would persecute Christians viciously if they could. So I think they hate God and they hate Christians who love God, and I think they would crack down on Christians across the board if they could. But I think they're not going to be able to do that. And I think they'll be able to do it in some places in the country. And I think we're in the middle of a big resort now with people moving. And I see, in agreement with what you said, I see the people moving here, and there have been many who have moved here. I see them as reinforcements, and this place as a staging area for mounting a counterattack. So it's not like, okay, let's go hide in the woods. So I see this as marshaling forces and preparing ourselves for the attempted persecution. I think that there will be places where persecution will be real and Christians will suffer in places like Illinois and California, Massachusetts. I think there will be successful persecutions there, but I don't think there will be successful persecutions in Oklahoma or Alabama or Texas or here. So I think it's going to be a mixed bag.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think so. And I think we need to be also really careful with using the word persecution, because most of the church in the world and most of the church throughout history experienced the kind of persecution that we don't mean, right? When we say persecution, there's a difference between, bake the cake or lose your company and go to the gallows, So I don't see go to the gallows,
Coming here.
coming here. Yeah.
Yes.
Baucham, I wanted to ask you about Marxist ideology in the third world. So in the academia and in government, do you see Marxist ideology as a legitimate threat? How is that growing? Because I know the academia is pretty integrated. America exports that everywhere. So do you see Marxist ideology, having its impact on the third world? And what kind of threat is it there?
Yeah, it's much bigger in the third world. Yeah, Marxist ideology is much bigger in the third world. It's very prominent and very popular in the third world. And it's interesting because, especially in the post-colonial era, Marxism sounds good, right? It's like we were under the thumb of these colonial masters, and now we're free, and then the Marxists are there going, here's what happened to you, and here's how we can, help you now, or whatever. So that's one of the very interesting things, for example, in Zambia, is there is this sort of undercurrent of Marxist ideology that is present in much of sub-Saharan Africa. And not only is it the post-colonial era, but it's also tribalism, right? Africans are tribal people. They're collectivists, right? That's part of the African traditional worldview, collectivism. So, again, Marxism just kind of, it resonates.
Taps into that.
It really does. It resonates. So, you're post-colonial and Marxism taps into that. You're tribal and Marxism, taps into that as well. So, I walk around and there are minibuses, right? We have minibuses, basically these little vans, that's the bus system. It's kind of an informal bus system. And, you see Che Guevara on the buses everywhere, and most Zambians have no idea, who that guy is. And I like to, if I get a chance, pull up a couple of Che Guevara quotes on my phone and share them with people who are wearing Che Guevara t-shirts, because he was an incredible racist. despised black people especially. Yeah, so I just realized, like, hey, who do you think said this? It's like, what? The guy on your shirt. What? But yeah, so Marxism is very prevalent in the developing world. Yeah.
Okay. Do we have another question here?
Pastorally, I work for a mission organization, and I work with a lot of different partners, most of whom are not Reformed, most of whom are Baptistic. But within the Reformed world, I see much more unification between you guys than across the broad spectrum of the Southern Baptist Convention, where the thread of baptism holds together liberals and charismatics and the 1689 guys. And so there's a whole lot more uniformity and cohesion within the Reformed world. And watching all of the things spin crazy in the last 3 years and trying to bring our brothers and sisters along. I live in the South where we're still arguing over, I'm a 3.7 point Calvinist. And I'm thinking, guys, we're so far beyond Calvinism. If you want to have a consistent biblical ethic and worldview and see how all of these things work, you got to start thinking, how do we do that without just throwing hand grenades at people?
Great question. I think Voddie ought to answer it.
I'm just wondering why he's giving up on the hand grenade option. Yeah. Well, like I said, it's got to be local. It's got to be local. For example, you talk about like our relationship or relationships with other brethren in the circles. I think most people assume that Doug and I, or John MacArthur and I, or others, that we're on the phone together all the time, and that we're comparing notes all the time, and that we're not. We don't ever talk.
He lives in Zambia.
Except the times when we're together, right? But what it is there's this local commitment, right? We're not manufacturing brotherhood, camaraderie, and fellowship. It's head down, local commitment, right? Confessional convictions, and then look up and have opportunities to partner with guys who are also head down, local commitment, doing the same thing, but from a lot of the same ethos, you know?
And I would add to that, one thing I would add to that is in the local setting, when you're trying to build coalitions or work together with other believers, for decades, evangelicalism has sort of adopted a lowest common denominator approach. How much water can we pour in the soup and still call it soup?
Yeah.
Right? And I think that we ought to be thinking about going the opposite way. How much truth can we affirm?
Right.
Instead of how much truth can we water down?
Right.
Because one of the things, no Lutherans that I know of that are here, but I like interacting with Lutherans, conservative Lutherans, because they wake up in the morning knowing what they think.
Yeah.
They're confessional. They've got this, and
Yes.
I can talk to them, and we can find out inside of 3 minutes where we agree and where we disagree, because they're confessional and I'm confessional. It's the same with us.
Right.
So I know where the 1689 and the Westminster vary, and most of it is the same. And we have the same shared outlook that we're both applying in local settings. And so we should want to affirm as much truth as we can.
Right.
And that should be the direction we're leaning. And for 10, 15 years ago, people would say, well, I think you're being divisive because you're being such a Calvinist. But in the clown world of the last 2 years, a lot of people started flocking to our church because we're the only ones who stayed open, or we were their only option. And so it's sort of like the more decided and pronounced confessional approach suddenly became attractive to people, and because truth unifies, and diluting the truth in the long run, I don't think does unify.
Right.
So, yeah. Go ahead.
Dr. Baucam and Pastor Doug. First, I want to thank you both for your contributions to the body of Christ and your what I call your method of blunt force preaching, and I love it. So, being a 1689 confessional guy, I was Calvinist before skinny jeans and before it was cool. So one of the things I've also done is spend a lot of time in apologetics, and one question that I really have a hard time articulating and looking to you is when it comes to predestination and when it comes to election and predestination before the foundations of the world, what is the answer for aborted babies?
You mean their destiny? Where they?
The question that actually came to me was, why would God predestine babies to be murdered in the womb?
Okay, so it's not a question about whether the babies are saved. It's a question of why would God allow this horrific?
What was their election? What was their if they were elected? So that was the question. Is like, so none of them were elected, so they're just disposable.
Okay, so there's a long. This is a long history going back at least to Augustine, where Augustine was wrestling with the fact of he had his views on baptismal regeneration and are unbaptized infants who die, are they saved? And then Augustine got tarred as a baby dammer because he said babies could be lost and so forth. But generally speaking, in the modern era, saying the last 200 years, there's been a general consensus among Reformed thinkers and theologians that infants who die are not damned. Infants who die are not eternally lost. And there are different arguments I've got one set of arguments that I would agree with that, but there's one set of arguments that I would offer, and perhaps another guy would offer, Charles Hodge would offer a different argument. But the issue is, so then the issue becomes, this is a horrific evil, and so why does God allow evil, which is a standard apologetic issue. But if the children are saved, not because they deserve it, not because they're cute, not because they're innocent, because they're by nature object of wrath like the rest. So it's not like, we're not saying that the children are free of original sin, but it's how does God save them? How does God save them? If we say that, then, and we have an answer for that, then the question simply becomes, how can a good God ordain acts that are so intrinsically evil as abortion or the murder of a child in any circumstance or other evils? But once you're on that territory, you can see that, and this is the verse that did me in when I was becoming a Calvinist. This was the thing that, in Acts 4, it says that Herod, Pontius Pilate, and all the Jews did what God determined beforehand should happen. And then Acts 2, it says they did it with wicked hands. So they were sinful. Judas sinned, Pilate sinned. Jesus said the Jews who turned me over to you are guilty of a worse sin than you are, meaning that he was guilty of sin. But they did what God's purpose and plan determined beforehand should happen. So the worst evil that was ever committed in the history of the world was the crucifixion of Jesus. And that was the moment of the devil's triumph. And that was the moment when I was saved. Right? So if the rulers of this age had known what they were doing, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. So God has a purpose and a plan that can weave glory out of the most atrocious material. And that would be the answer that I would give. I don't think the infants are damned, but I think it's a great evil, and I think God is going to be glorified in the last day through it. I don't know if you... Thank you. Yes?
How would you instruct a young Christian who wants to learn how to apply the biblical worldview to woke or Marx ideology without buying into the lies that it teaches? Is there a book or a collection of works that one can research so that he can respond to those ideas biblically?
Yeah, let me just give a few book recommends, and maybe you could add some book recommends for that sort of preparation. I would say Idols for Destruction by Herbert Schlossberg is a magnificent book. Carl Trueman's The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self is a wonderful book. We Become What We Worship by Beale.
Yeah, G.K. Beale.
Beale. And then there was a fourth one. That'll do. That'll do. Do you have any
The Quest for Cosmic Justice.
Quest for Cosmic?
Yeah.
Soul.
Soul. Yeah.
And also Thomas Sowell, The Vision of the Anointed.
Yes.
Vision of the Anointed.
And then there's this Fault Lines book that might, you know,
That's totally awesome.
might be helpful. You know?
So going back to the question of persecution, and you alluded to the fact that you foresee that things could get really bad at some point. So from a uniquely American perspective where we enjoy, you know, the rights under the Second Amendment, if there is an institutional or governmental systemic persecution, at what point do we pick up arms? The precedent being the Book of Esther. And at what point do we go like all of the Christians and Christ went? You know, humbly and
With
sacrificially.
like martyrdom.
Right.
Yeah, so I would pick up arms, except that I unfortunately lost all my guns in a boating accident. Like so many of my friends. So this is something that the Reformed had to hammer out in the course of the Reformation. This is not a new issue. Recommend a couple of other books, Vindicii contra Tyrannos, which Canon Press publishes, written by Huguenot in the 1500s. Also, Samuel Rutherford's Lex Rex. Rutherford hammers, basically this is the three-tiered response that the Reformed presented to encroaching governmental tyranny.
And lesser magistrate.
Yeah, lesser magistrates, yes.
That book.
By Truella,
Yeah,
yes, the Doctrine of the Lesser Magistrates. And Calvin's Institutes, Book 4, would all be resources. The three-tier response is, number one, when tyranny arises, you prophesy against it, you preach against it, you teach, and I see us as in that stage now. That's where we are. We're explaining, educating. That's the first one. You prophesy or preach against it. The second one is you flee. Jesus says when you're persecuted in one city, flee to the next. That's how America got settled, by a lot of people just pulling up stakes and coming here. That's the second stage. The third stage, and this is something that Rutherford argues, is taking up arms for defensive purposes only. So revolution is never acceptable. You never try to overthrow the existing government. But there are times when you can take up arms to defend yourself or your city or your territory. When you take up arms defensively, it's a different situation than Jesus and the apostles and the early Christians. In the first century, it was a completely different social circumstance. They had their words and their preaching, and that's what they had. And when they arrest you and throw you to the lions, that's what they're going to do. They have got all the power. But in the Reformation, running up to the Reformational time, for example, in France, they had a feudal system. And the feudal system meant that the king was the ultimate feudal lord, but you had various nobles around the country. And in France, a number of those noblemen had become Huguenots, had become Reformed Protestants. But in the feudal system, these noblemen, one of the things they had around their castle was their own army. And that's how the king would raise an army. If there was an invasion, the king would summon his vassals, the feudal lords. They would bring their army, and they'd come all together, and they'd be the king's army. Well, so all of a sudden, you've got these different noblemen who've become Christians, who've become Protestants, and they have an army right here. and then they get persecuted. Now what? Yeah. Now what? What do we do now? This is not Saint Bartholomew in the first century. This is not the same circumstance. So we have certain constitutional rights that are part of the heritage that Voddie was talking about, and those should be preserved and defended. But we are never revolutionaries. We're reformers, which means that we just say no, and we defend the perimeter. But I don't think we're there yet. I think we're close enough to it that we ought to be reading up on it. We ought to be studying our Reformed heritage on this topic, but I don't think we're there yet.
And we also have incredible legal resources and recourse
Yes, we do.
that so many people don't, right? And that's the most likely place that we'll see pitch battles.
Yeah, I agree with that. All right. Thank you very much.
That's it. Good.